The candle on the card table burned low, and Elena Whitmore's fate was decided before she even walked through the ballroom doors. Upstairs, in a private room thick with smoke and the smell of brandy, her cousin Margaret Ashford slid the last card face down and smiled at the man across from her. He did not smile back. He never did. The Duke of Ashcombe was known for many things, and warmth was not one of them. "You wagered a person," he said quietly, not looking up from the cards. "Not coin, not land, a person." "She is my cousin," Margaret said, as if that settled the matter. "And you have already won her, Your Grace. The cards do not lie." He studied the table for a long moment. Then he gathered the cards into a neat stack, the way he did everything, with total control, and said, "Bring her to me at the ball. I will decide for myself whether this debt is worth collecting." Margaret's smile widened. She had expected refusal, expected the famous Duke to walk away in disgust at her recklessness. Instead, she had given him a new kind of entertainment, and men like him rarely turned those down. 2 floors below, Elena had no idea any of this was happening. She stood at the edge of the grand ballroom in a borrowed gown of deep blue silk, watching candlelight scatter across 300 masked faces. The Ashford family had fallen on hard times 2 years ago, when her uncle's shipping investments collapsed overnight, and Elena had learned to live quietly at the edges of grand rooms like this one. She did not belong here, not really. She was here because Margaret had insisted, had practically dragged her out of the house with promises of music and cake and one night of forgetting their troubles. "You look nervous," said a voice beside her. Elena turned. A man in a black mask stood there, tall, dressed in a dark green coat that fit him too well to be anything but tailored by the finest hands in London. His mask covered the top half of his face, but she could see his mouth, set in a line that was not quite a smile. "I am not nervous," she said. "I am counting the exits." A wise habit at any party. You would be surprised how often it comes in useful, especially at parties, where the punch is watered down and the gossip is not. That earned her something close to a laugh, though he caught it before it fully escaped. "You do not enjoy dancing, then?" "I enjoy dancing very much. I simply do not trust anyone who asks me before he has told me his name." "Then let us fix that." He extended a gloved hand. "I am told, by people who dislike me, that I have no name worth knowing. But for tonight, you may call me nothing at all, and I will call you the same, and we will see if 2 nameless strangers can manage one dance without disaster." Elena looked at his hand. She looked at the crowd swirling behind him, the candles, the music rising and falling like a held breath. She thought of the small, cold rooms waiting for her at home, and the quiet ache that lived there. "One dance," she said, and placed her hand in his. "But if you step on my feet, nameless stranger, I will remember your crime forever, mask or no mask. Then I shall endeavor not to be remembered for my feet." They moved onto the floor together, and something shifted in the air between them, something Elena could not name and did not try to. His hand at her waist was steady, his steps were sure, unhurried, as though he had never once in his life felt the need to rush toward anything. She found herself matching his rhythm without effort, as though her body had been waiting for exactly this partner, and had simply not known it until now. "You dance like someone who has had very good teachers," she said, "and very little joy in using what they taught you." His eyes, the only part of his face fully visible beneath the mask, flickered with something sharp and surprised. "That is an unusually direct thing to say to a stranger. You started it, by pretending to be nameless. I am only matching your honesty with my own. Careful. Honesty is a dangerous habit in a room full of masks." "Everything interesting is dangerous," Elena said. "That is what makes it interesting." He turned her, slow and deliberate, and for a moment the candlelight caught her face fully, and she saw something change in his expression, a kind of stillness that had not been there a moment before, as if he were looking at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he suddenly, badly, wants to solve. "Tell me something true," he said. "Not your name, something true." Elena considered this. The music swelled around them, violins climbing toward the height of the piece, and she felt suddenly reckless, the way she imagined gamblers must feel, just before they pushed all their coins onto the table. "I came here tonight because my cousin insisted," she said, "and because I wanted, for one evening, to forget that my family has very little money, and even less hope, and to simply exist as a woman in a beautiful dress, dancing with a stranger who does not know enough about me to pity me. She had not meant to say so much. The words simply came, drawn out of her by the strange privacy that masks provided, the sense that whatever she said here, in this suspended hour, would not follow her home. His hand tightened, just slightly, at her waist. "I do not pity you," he said. "I do not think pity is the correct response to a woman who counts exits at parties and insults a man's dancing before she knows his name. What is the correct response then?" "I have not decided yet," he said. "Ask me again before midnight." The music ended, and neither of them stepped back right away. Around them, other couples were breaking apart, laughing, moving toward the refreshment tables, but Elena and the masked stranger stood still amid the shifting crowd, as though they had claimed a small, private pocket of time that the party could not touch. "Will you tell me your name now?" she asked. "Will you tell me yours?" She smiled. "You first. You are the one who claimed to have none worth knowing." Something in his jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought she saw real hesitation there, real weight behind his silence. Then a voice cut across the ballroom, bright and familiar, and Elena's stomach dropped before she even understood why. "Elena, there you are." Margaret was crossing the floor toward them, her face flushed with wine, and something else, something Elena would later understand to be triumph. She reached them just as the great clock in the corner of the ballroom began to chime midnight, and around the room, hands rose to masks, ribbons were untied, and the great unveiling began, the moment every masquerade built toward, when secrets became faces, and strangers became known. "Cousin," Margaret said, breathless, "you must let me introduce you properly. This is His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe." The masked man's hand rose, slow and deliberate, and untied the ribbon at the back of his head. The mask fell away. Elena had heard the name Ashcombe before, whispered in drawing rooms with a particular kind of dread, the way people spoke of storms and debts and things that could not be reasoned with. She had heard he was cold. She had heard he had broken 2 engagements without a single word of explanation, that he had ruined a rival merchant so thoroughly the man had left the country in disgrace, that he smiled perhaps twice a year, and neither smile had ever reached his eyes. None of that prepared her for the face now revealed above the dark green coat, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that had, only minutes ago, nearly smiled at her wit, eyes the color of storm clouds fixed now not on Margaret, but on Elena, steady and unreadable. "You," Elena said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Me," he agreed. Margaret's smile was wide and pleased with itself, utterly failing to notice the sudden tension crackling between the 2 people in front of her. "Is this not wonderful? I told him all about you, Elena, and he simply had to meet you tonight." "Margaret," Elena said carefully, "what have you done?" "I have done nothing but arrange the most fortunate meeting of your life," Margaret said, and there was something underneath her bright tone now, something brittle and a little desperate. "His Grace has agreed to a match, cousin, between you and him." The ballroom seemed to tilt slightly beneath Elena's feet. Around her, the music had started again, some new piece, cheerful and entirely wrong for the moment, and masked faces continued to become known faces, laughter rising and falling, none of it touching the small, frozen space where Elena stood staring at her cousin. "A match," Elena repeated. "You arranged a match, for me, without telling me. It is a wonderful opportunity. Margaret." The word came out sharp enough that several nearby guests glanced over. Elena lowered her voice, but the fury underneath it did not lessen. "I do not know what you have done, or what you have promised, but I am not a horse to be sold at auction. I have a voice. I have a say in my own life. Elena, please, you do not understand the trouble we are in. Then explain it to me plainly, instead of hiding it inside a masquerade and a stranger's mask." The Duke had not spoken through any of this. He stood watching Elena with an intensity that made her want to look away and, at the same time, made it impossible to do so. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her, though Margaret leaned in to hear it too. "Your cousin," he said, "wagered your hand against me in a game of cards 2 hours ago. I won. I came down to this ballroom, intending to look at the woman I had, apparently acquired. and to decide whether I wished to honor a debt that was never rightfully hers to offer. The room went very quiet in Elena's ears, though the music played on around her. "And what," she said, when she trusted her voice again, "did you decide?" His eyes did not leave her face. "I decided that the woman who counted exits and called my dancing joyless was not someone I intended to walk away from. Not tonight, and not, I suspect, for a long while after." "That is not your decision to make," Elena said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake, even as her whole body seemed to be shaking underneath it. "I was danced with. I was charmed, I will admit it, by a man in a mask who told me nothing true about himself. But I was not one. I am not a hand of cards, Your Grace, however my cousin chose to treat me." Something flickered across his face, quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. Not anger. Something closer to respect, though wrapped in frustration. "No," he agreed. "You are not a hand of cards. But your family's debts are real, Miss Whitmore. And your cousin's recklessness has placed you inside them, whether either of us wishes it or not. I am prepared to be reasonable about how we proceed. I am not prepared to pretend the debt does not exist." "Reasonable," Elena said bitterly. "You call this reasonable." "I call it honest," he said, "which is more than your cousin has managed to be with you tonight." Margaret flinched at that, and for a single unguarded moment, Elena saw real fear in her cousin's face. The fear of someone who has gambled everything on a single throw, and only now understood how badly it might fall apart. It softened Elena's anger, just slightly, into something closer to exhausted sorrow. "I need air," Elena said, to no one in particular, and turned from them both, moving quickly through the crowd toward the terrace doors, past masked faces, now unmasked, past laughter that felt suddenly very far away, as though it belonged to a different, simpler night than the one she now found herself in. The terrace was blessedly empty. Cold night air swept over her heated skin, and Elena gripped the stone railing and stared out at the dark garden below, trying to slow her breathing, trying to make sense of the last hour, of a mask and a dance, and a name that had turned her whole evening inside out. She heard footsteps behind her, and did not need to turn to know who they belonged to. "I did not come to argue further," the Duke said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I came to say that whatever happens next, it will be your choice, not mine, and not your cousin's. I have never in my life forced a woman into anything, and I do not intend to begin with you." Elena turned to face him, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, so different now from the charming stranger who had asked her to dance, and yet, underneath it, somehow the same man entirely. "Then why declare it at all?" she asked. "Why not simply forgive the debt and let us both walk away?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because," he finally said, "for the first time in longer than I care to admit, I danced with someone tonight who made me forget, for the length of one song, everything I am supposed to be. And I find I am not ready to let that go, simply because it arrived wrapped in a debt I did not ask for." The words hung in the cold air between them, honest in a way that unsettled her more than any demand could have.
"That is not fair,"
Elena whispered. "You cannot say things like that to me and expect me not to be moved by them." "I am not trying to be fair," he said. "I told you, I am trying to be honest. There is a difference, and I suspect you, of all people, understand it better than most." Below them, the garden stretched dark and quiet, and somewhere behind them the music played on, and the whole glittering ballroom continued its bright, oblivious celebration, unaware that on the terrace above, a game that had begun as a joke and a wager was quietly becoming something neither Elena Whitmore nor the Duke of Ashcombe fully understood, but that both of them, despite everything, were suddenly unwilling to walk away from. "One waltz," Elena said finally, half to herself. "That is all this began as, one dance with a stranger." "And now?" he asked quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, at the storm-gray eyes and the mouth that had almost smiled at her wit, and felt something inside her chest turn over, slow and unwilling, and entirely against her better judgment. "Now," she said, "I am no longer certain it was ever only a game at all." Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed in the small house on Chapel Street, staring at the ceiling, replaying the terrace conversation over and over until the words lost their shape and became simply sound, the low, steady voice of a man she had known for one evening and already could not stop thinking about. By the time gray morning light crept through her curtains, she had decided 3 separate times to refuse the match entirely, and changed her mind 3 separate times as well, each time remembering the way he had looked at her when he said he was not ready to let go of what one dance had given him. She rose, dressed in her plainest gown, and went down to breakfast, where she found Margaret already seated at the table, pale and hollow-eyed, pushing a piece of toast around her plate without eating it. "You look as though you did not sleep either," Elena said, taking her seat across from her cousin. "I could not," Margaret admitted. "Elena, I owe you an explanation, and an apology, though I know neither will undo what I have done." "Then give me both, and quickly, before I lose what little patience I have left this morning." Margaret set down her fork. Her hands were trembling. "You know we have debts. What you do not know is how deep they run. Father borrowed against the house itself 2 years ago, after the shipping losses, and the man he borrowed from has grown impatient. He came to me last week and told me plainly that if the debt is not settled within the month, he will take the house, and we will have nowhere to go." Elena's stomach tightened. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" "Because I hoped I could fix it myself, without you ever knowing how bad things had become. I thought, if I could win enough at cards, or find some clever way around it." Margaret's voice cracked. "The Duke was at the same card table. He is known to be an extraordinary player, and I thought, foolishly, that I might beat him, and use the winnings to settle everything. I lost every hand. And in my panic, in the last hand, I wagered something I should never have touched." "You wagered me," Elena said quietly. "I wagered a match," Margaret corrected, though the distinction felt thin and cold to Elena's ears. "I told myself I was arranging your future, not selling you. I told myself that a duke's wife would never want for anything again, that I was saving you, saving all of us. But I know now that I did not ask you. I took a choice that was never mine to take, and I am sorrier for that than I can say." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, anger and pity warring inside her chest. She thought of her uncle, gentle and foolish, who had never recovered from the shock of his lost fortune. She thought of the house around her, small and shabby but still home, still the only roof she had left. And she thought of the Duke's voice on the terrace, honest in a way she had not expected and could not quite forgive him for yet. "I am not angry that we are poor," she said finally. "I have never been angry about that. I am angry that you decided, alone, in a smoke-filled room, what my life would become, and only told me after the decision was already made." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I know, and I do not ask you to forgive it. I only ask that you let me try to help fix what I have broken. How do you propose to do that?" "The Duke sent a note this morning," Margaret said, sliding a folded paper across the table. "He wishes to call on you this afternoon. He says, and I believe him, that whatever happens next will be your decision entirely." Elena stared at the note without opening it. Her heart was beating too fast, and she hated herself a little for how much of that quickened pulse was not fear, but something closer to anticipation. "Read it," Margaret urged gently. "Please." Elena unfolded the paper. The handwriting was precise, elegant, controlled in the same way the man himself seemed controlled, every stroke deliberate. "Miss Whitmore, I would like to call on you this afternoon, not to press a claim I have no right to press, but to speak with you plainly about what your cousin's debt means, and what options exist that do not require you to sacrifice anything you are unwilling to sacrifice. I understand you may wish to refuse me outright. If so, I will accept that refusal and trouble you no further, but I would ask for the chance to explain myself before you decide. Ashcombe." Elena read it twice. There was nothing in it of the demanding, ruthless Duke of Rumor, nothing of the man who had, by all accounts, destroyed rivals without hesitation. There was only careful, restrained honesty, and beneath it, something that felt almost like an apology for circumstances he had not created, but had, admittedly, agreed to use. "I will see him," Elena said finally, "but I make no promises beyond that." "That is more than I dared hope for," Margaret said, relief and shame mixing plainly on her face. The Duke arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, driving a plain black carriage with no crest visible, dressed in dark, understated clothes that made him look less like a duke and more like an ordinary gentleman come to call. Elena received him in the small front parlor, the best room in the house, though its faded curtains and worn furniture told their own quiet story of hardship that she felt, uncomfortably, he must be cataloging even as he took his seat. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, once the maid had brought tea and retreated. "I agreed to listen," Elena corrected. "That is not the same as agreeing to anything else." "No," he acknowledged, "it is not, and I would not want it to be." She studied him across the small table between them, this man who had seemed so different last night, laughing behind his mask, honest on the terrace, and who now sat rigid and formal in her worn parlor chair, as though the daylight had brought back all the walls the darkness had let him set aside. "You said in your note that you wished to explain yourself," Elena said. "Please do." He set down his teacup, untouched. "Your cousin's debt is real, and it is significant, though I have since learned it is smaller than the sum your family owes to your creditor. I could settle it entirely, quietly, without any expectation attached. I want you to understand that as a possibility, before we discuss anything further. Your family's home does not need to depend on your marriage. I can free you of that particular fear regardless of what you decide about me." Elena had not expected this. She had braced herself for pressure, for the cold demands of rumor, and instead, he was offering her an exit before she had even asked for one. "Why would you do that?" she asked slowly. "If it costs you the very thing you claimed last night you did not wish to let go of." "Because forcing someone into a match through fear is not something I am willing to do, regardless of what I want," he said. "I told you on the terrace that I have never forced a woman into anything. I meant it. If you choose to walk away entirely, your family's debt will still be settled. That offer does not change based on your answer." Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the trick she was certain must be hidden somewhere in this generosity, and finding, uncomfortably, none. "And if I do not walk away?" she asked quietly. "What then?" Something shifted in his expression, a careful hope he seemed to be trying very hard to keep contained. "Then I would ask for the chance to court you properly, not through a wager, not through obligation, but the ordinary way, with visits and conversation, and time, so that whatever we decide together is built on something real, and not on a debt neither of us chose." "You want to start again?" Elena said, as though last night never happened. "No," he said. "Last night happened, and I would not wish it undone. I only want the chance to build on it honestly, instead of letting a card game decide what we owe each other." Elena sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she had turned over his voice on the terrace, looking for the catch and finding, again, none she could point to. "You are not at all what I expected," she admitted finally. "The Duke of Ashcombe I have heard described as cold, ruthless, a man who destroys anyone who crosses him and feels nothing about it after." Something dark passed briefly across his face, there and gone. "That reputation was not built without cause," he said quietly. "I will not pretend I have never been ruthless, Miss Whitmore. I have been, when circumstances demanded it, and I likely will be again, but I have never been cruel to someone who did not first try to harm me or the people under my protection. There is a difference, though I understand the distinction is easy to lose in gossip." "What happened?" Elena asked, before she could stop herself. "To make you into someone people whisper about with dread?" His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he would deflect, the way powerful men so often did when asked to explain themselves. Instead, he answered. "My younger brother died 3 years ago," he said, voice carefully even. "Circumstances I do not discuss easily, even now. In the aftermath, several men I had trusted attempted to use my grief against me, to seize control of holdings that were not theirs to seize. I stopped them, thoroughly. I have not regretted it, and I would do it again without hesitation. But I understand that stopping them the way I did earned me a reputation I have not much bothered to correct since." Elena's anger, which had simmered since the previous night, softened into something gentler, more complicated. "I am sorry," she said, "about your brother." "Thank you," he said, and something in his voice told her he did not hear those words often, or did not know quite what to do with them when he did. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that did not feel uncomfortable, only full, weighted with things neither of them had expected to share so soon. "I need time," Elena said finally. To think, to understand what I want, separate from my family's debts, and separate from whatever spell one waltz and one terrace conversation managed to cast on me. Take whatever time you need, he said. I am not going anywhere, Miss Whitmore, and your family's debt will be settled regardless of your answer. I meant that. I believe you, Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she truly did. He rose to leave a short while later, and at the door, he paused, turning back to face her with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something almost uncertain beneath the composed exterior. May I call again? He asked, even while you are deciding, not to press you, only to know you better, so that whatever you decide is a decision about the man I actually am, rather than the rumors that have followed me for years. Elena considered him for a long moment, this strange, careful, unexpectedly honest man who had walked into her life through the worst possible door and was now, somehow, trying to walk out through a better one. You may call again, she said, but I make no promises about what I will decide, Your Grace. I would not want a promise made before you were ready to keep it, he said. Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore. He left, and Elena stood in the doorway watching his plain black carriage disappear down the street, feeling the strange, unsettled sensation of a life quietly rearranging itself around her, one honest conversation at a time. Behind her, in the small hallway, she heard the soft sound of Margaret exhaling, as though she too had been holding her breath through the entire visit. Well? Margaret asked carefully. Elena turned to face her cousin, a small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, despite everything.
He is going to settle the debt regardless of my answer,
she said.
So you may stop looking at me like a woman about to be sold at market, cousin.
Whatever happens next between the Duke and me will happen because I choose it, not because I have to. Relief broke openly across Margaret's face, and beneath it, something like shame renewed. I am glad, she said quietly. Truly, Elena, whatever you decide, I am glad you will decide it freely. Elena nodded and turned back toward the window, watching the empty street where his carriage had been, feeling the strange new weight of a choice that was, for the first time since the previous night, entirely her own to make. Over the following 2 weeks, the Duke called 4 times. The first visit, he brought no gifts and made no declarations, only sat with her in the parlor and asked careful, genuine questions about her life before the shipping losses, about the books she loved, about the small dreams she had once had and set aside when the family's fortune collapsed. Elena found herself talking more than she intended, drawn out by the quality of his listening, the way he seemed to actually hear what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. The second visit, he arrived with a worn, well-loved copy of a novel she had mentioned in passing, one she had owned as a girl and lost when the family moved to their smaller house. She had not asked him to remember it, he simply had. You did not need to do this, she said, turning the book over in her hands, throat tight with an emotion she had not expected. I know, he said. I wanted to. The third visit, they walked together in the small public garden 2 streets from her house, and for the first time, Elena saw him laugh, truly laugh, when she described Margaret's disastrous attempt to teach herself French cooking the previous winter, an attempt that had ended with a small kitchen fire and a ruined pot that the family still could not discuss without laughing. His laugh transformed his whole face, softened the sharp lines rumor had built around him, and Elena found herself wanting, quite badly, to hear it again. The fourth visit, he told her about his brother. They sat in the garden as the afternoon light turned gold, and he spoke slowly, carefully, about a boy 3 years younger than himself, reckless and bright and endlessly curious, who had died in circumstances the Duke still would not fully name, though Elena understood, from what he did say, that it involved an illness that had come on suddenly and taken his brother within a matter of weeks, and that the Duke had spent those weeks at his brother's bedside, watching a life he could not save slip away regardless of every resource, every physician, every desperate effort he had thrown against it. After, he said, staring at the garden path rather than at her, I found I could not bear weakness in myself, or gentleness that might be mistaken for it. So I built something harder instead. It has served me well in business. I am not certain it has served me well anywhere else. Elena reached over, without entirely deciding to, and placed her hand over his on the bench between them. He went very still, as though the gesture was more than he had expected, more than he had allowed himself to hope for. "I do not think gentleness is weakness," she said quietly. "I think it is the harder thing, most days, to hold on to. Anyone can build walls. It takes more courage to leave a door open, even after everything that has walked through it and hurt you." He turned his hand beneath hers, so their palms met, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen from anyone before, something raw and unguarded, and entirely without the careful control that seemed to govern every other part of him. "Elena," he said, her name for the first time without any title attached to it. "I do not know how to do this slowly. I have never wanted anything the way I find myself wanting your good opinion, and I do not know how to hide that from you, however unwise it may be to say so this soon." Her heart was beating very fast. "Then do not hide it," she said. "I find I have grown tired of masks, Your Grace, in more ways than one." "Alexander," he said. "My name is Alexander. I would like you to use it, if you are willing." "Alexander," she repeated, testing the shape of it, feeling something settle warmly in her chest as she said it. "I am willing." They sat together as the light faded, hands joined on the bench, saying very little more, needing to say very little more. The silence between them full, in a way that no ballroom, no masquerade, no clever conversation had ever quite managed to be. But even as Elena allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future built on this quiet, honest thing growing between them, she did not yet know that Margaret's debt was only the smallest of the threats gathering around her, or that the true danger to her fragile new happiness had not yet even shown its face. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the front door sometime before dawn, with no name attached and no explanation, only 3 lines written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. "Ask the Duke of Ashcombe what happened to Charlotte Price. Ask him why she left London and never returned. Ask him before you give him your heart, because he will not offer the truth freely." Elena read it 3 times at the breakfast table, her tea growing cold beside her, before she finally set it down and looked up to find Margaret watching her with concern. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Elena slid the letter across the table without a word. She watched her cousin's face change as she read it, watched confusion give way to something more troubled. "Who is Charlotte Price?" Margaret asked. "I do not know," Elena admitted. "I have never heard the name before this morning." "It could be nothing. A jealous rival, someone spreading rumors to frighten you away from him." "It could be," Elena agreed slowly. "But I would rather know the truth than spend the rest of my life wondering." She spent the day in a state of quiet distraction, unable to focus on anything, the 3 unsigned lines circling endlessly through her thoughts. By the time Alexander called that afternoon, she had decided she would simply ask him directly and see what his face did with the question before he had time to prepare an answer. He arrived looking, as always, composed and unhurried, dressed in a gray coat that made his eyes seem darker than usual. Carrying a small bundle of flowers he presented to her with the same careful attention he brought to everything. But Elena did not take them right away. "Who is Charlotte Price?" she asked instead. The flowers stayed suspended between them for a long moment. Something crossed his face, quick and complicated, gone almost before she could name it, but not quite fast enough to hide entirely. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, voice carefully even. "An unsigned letter, delivered this morning. It told me to ask you what happened to her, and warned me that you would not offer the truth freely." Elena watched him closely as she spoke. "So I am asking, what happened to her?" He set the flowers down on the small table by the door, slowly, as though buying himself time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual calm. "Charlotte Price was my fiancée," he said, 3 years ago, before my brother died." Elena's stomach tightened, though she kept her face steady. "You were engaged?" "Yes." "For nearly a year. We were, by most accounts, a well-matched pair, and I believed myself content with the arrangement, though I understand now that contentment and love are not the same thing, and I mistook one for the other for longer than I should have." "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him deciding how much to say, weighing honesty against whatever instinct had kept this story buried for 3 years. "My brother's illness came on suddenly," he said finally. "I spent every waking hour at his bedside for 6 weeks. Charlotte grew impatient with my absence from society, from her, From the wedding preparations she wished to continue regardless of what was happening in my family. When my brother died, she came to me within a week and told me she believed I had grieved long enough, that it was time to set my sorrow aside and resume our plans as though nothing had happened. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. And you refused. I ended the engagement, he said, quietly, without public scandal, though I understand rumors have circulated regardless, twisted into whatever shape suits the person telling them. Charlotte left London shortly after, humiliated, I imagine, by a broken engagement she did not choose. I have not seen or spoken to her since. Someone sent me a letter this morning suggesting you were the villain of that story, Elena said slowly, suggesting there was some truth you were hiding. There is no hidden truth, he said, only a woman who could not offer patience when I needed it most, and a man who was not willing to build a marriage on that kind of absence. I am not proud of how coldly I ended things. I could have been gentler, but I was not lying then, and I am not lying to you now. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the deception she had half expected to find, and finding instead only a tired, careful honesty, the look of a man revisiting a wound he had thought long closed. I believe you, she said finally, and watched some of the tension leave his shoulders. But I do not understand who would send such a letter, or why, 3 years after the fact. Nor do I, he admitted, though I intend to find out. He did not have to search long. 2 days later, at a small gathering hosted by one of Margaret's few remaining society connections, Elena found herself face to face with a striking, dark-haired woman she had never met, who introduced herself with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Miss Whitmore, the woman said, I have heard so much about you. I am Charlotte Price. Elena went very still. Around them, the party continued its polite murmur, entirely unaware that 2 women, with a very complicated shared connection, had just been introduced. Miss Price, Elena said carefully, I did not expect to meet you so soon after hearing your name. Something flickered in Charlotte's expression, quick and calculating. Ah, so he has told you about me. I wondered whether he would, or whether he would let you find out some other way. He told me you ended your engagement over his grief, Elena said, watching Charlotte's face carefully. I understand it differently than that. Charlotte's smile did not waver, but something sharpened behind her eyes. Of course he would tell it that way. Alexander has always been very skilled at rearranging the truth to suit whatever version of himself he wishes to present. Did he tell you why his brother truly died? Did he tell you what role he played in it? Elena's stomach turned cold. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Charlotte said, voice dropping low, that you ask him directly what happened in the weeks before his brother fell ill. Ask him about the argument they had. Ask him whether guilt, and not grief, is what truly turned him into the cold, ruthless man London now whispers about. You sent the letter, Elena said, understanding arriving cold and sudden. You sent it yourself. Charlotte's composure cracked, just slightly, into something more honest and more bitter. I sent it because you deserve to know what kind of man you are considering marrying, before you find yourself trapped the way I nearly was. He discarded me the moment I became inconvenient to his grief, Miss Whitmore. Do not imagine you are somehow different, somehow safe from the same fate. Elena drew herself up, steadying her voice despite the unease churning in her chest. I do not know the full truth of what happened between you and Alexander, Miss Price, but I know enough now to see that whatever wound you are carrying, you are using me to reopen it rather than facing him directly. That is not concern for my welfare. That is something else entirely. Charlotte's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought she might respond with more venom. Instead, something in her expression crumpled, just slightly, into a rawer, sadder honesty. Believe what you like, Charlotte said quietly, but ask him about his brother's illness. Ask him what truly happened before you give him anything else of yourself. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Elena standing alone, with a new, sharper uncertainty twisting beneath the old one. Elena did not wait for their next scheduled visit. She sent word to Alexander that evening, and he came within the hour, arriving at Chapel Street with an urgency that told her he understood something significant had happened. Charlotte Price approached me tonight, Elena said, before he had even fully removed his coat. She said something about your brother's illness, about an argument. She suggested guilt, not grief, was the true cause of everything you became after. Alexander went very still, the color draining slightly from his face. For a long moment he said nothing, and Elena felt her stomach drop, certain, in that terrible silence, that she was about to learn something that would change everything she had begun to believe about him. "Sit down," he said finally, his voice rough. "Please." "This is not a story I have told anyone, and I find I do not know how to tell it standing up." They sat together in the small parlor, and Alexander pressed his hands together, staring at them rather than at her, as though the story required all his concentration to release. "My brother and I argued," he said slowly, 3 weeks before he fell ill. He wished to invest in a venture I believed reckless, dangerous, likely to fail and take a significant portion of the family fortune with it. I refused to support it. I told him, in anger, that he was foolish, that he thought with his heart instead of his head, that he would ruin us all if left unchecked. He stormed out. We did not speak again for nearly 2 weeks, both of us too stubborn to be the first to apologize. Elena said nothing, letting him find his way through the story at his own pace. "When he fell ill," Alexander continued, "the physicians could not say for certain what caused it, only that it came on suddenly, a fever that would not break, and that his body seemed to fight against itself in ways they could not explain. I sat with him for 6 weeks, and in the delirium of the fever, he sometimes spoke as though our argument had never happened, and sometimes wept about it as though it were the last thing weighing on his mind. I have spent 3 years wondering whether the stress of our quarrel weakened him somehow, whether grief and anger opened some door that illness walked through. The physicians assured me there was no connection. I have never fully believed them." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Elena felt something in her chest ache fiercely at the sight of this controlled, careful man, laid bare by a guilt he had clearly carried alone for 3 years. "That is not the same as causing his death," she said gently. "An argument between brothers is not a crime, Alexander. Illness does not wait for convenient timing, and grief does not create fever." "I know that, in my mind," he said. "I have known it for 3 years. It has not stopped the guilt from living in my chest regardless." "Is that why you built the walls Charlotte spoke of?" Elena asked softly. "Not only from grief, but from guilt you would not let anyone see?" He looked up at her then, eyes bright with an emotion he seemed to be fighting hard to contain. "Yes," he admitted. "I could not bear anyone looking at me with pity, or worse, with the same accusation I leveled at myself every single day. It was easier to be cold. Cold does not require explanation. Cold does not invite questions I was not ready to answer." Elena reached over and took his hand, the same gesture she had offered him in the garden weeks before, and felt him grip it now with something closer to desperation than the careful restraint he usually maintained. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "all of it. Even the parts that frighten you to say aloud. Charlotte was not entirely wrong to warn you," he said quietly. "I did become someone harder after my brother died. I am not certain I have fully found my way back from that, even now. You deserve to know that, before you decide anything further about a future with me." "I think," Elena said slowly, "that the man who just told me this story, honestly, painfully, without trying to make himself look better than he is exactly the man I have been growing to care for these past weeks. Not the rumor, not the mask. This." Something broke open in his expression, relief and disbelief tangled together, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles that felt like both a question and a promise. "I do not deserve the kindness you keep offering me," he said quietly. "Let me decide what you deserve," Elena said. "I find I am rather good at deciding things for myself, when given the chance." He almost smiled at that, the ghost of the charm she had first met behind a mask returning briefly to his tired face. "Yes," he said, "I have noticed that about you. It is, I think, one of the things I admire most." They sat together a while longer, the fire burning low in the grate, and though the conversation had opened old wounds Elena had not expected to encounter so soon, she found that instead of driving her away, it had done the opposite entirely, binding her more closely to this careful, guarded, deeply wounded man who was, piece by piece, choosing to be honest with her, rather than hiding behind the reputation that had protected him for so long. But as Alexander finally rose to leave that night, his composure mostly restored, He paused at the door and turned back with an expression Elena had not seen from him before, something wary and alert. "Elena," he said, "I do not think Charlotte sent that letter out of simple bitterness alone. She is proud and cruel when wounded, but she has never before sought me out directly, not once in 3 years. Someone else may have encouraged her. I intend to find out who." "Do you suspect someone in particular?" Elena asked. "I am not certain yet," he said slowly. "But your cousin's original debt was owed to a man named Edmund Hale, was it not?" Elena's stomach tightened at the name. "Yes. Margaret mentioned him only once, but she seemed frightened of him. I have crossed paths with Edmund Hale before," Alexander said, something dark settling into his voice. "He is not a man who forgives easily when he believes he has been cheated of something he considers owed to him. And I did settle your family's debt entirely, Elena, in full, days after our first proper conversation. Perhaps too quietly, and too quickly, for a man like Hale to accept without seeking some other way to collect." A cold unease settled over Elena, the warm relief of the evening's honesty giving way to a new, sharper worry. "You think he is involved somehow? In the letter? In Charlotte?" "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that it would be wise for both of us to be very careful in the coming weeks. I will look into it further. In the meantime, promise me you will tell me immediately if anything else unusual happens. Any letters, any strangers, anything that unsettles you even slightly." "I promise," Elena said, though the promise did little to ease the sudden tightness in her chest. He left soon after, and Elena stood at the window watching his carriage disappear into the dark street, the same way she had watched it disappear weeks before, except now the warmth of that earlier afternoon had been replaced by something colder, more watchful, as though the quiet garden and honest confessions of the past weeks had only been the calm surface stretched thin over waters that ran considerably deeper and considerably more dangerous than she had allowed herself to imagine. Behind her, in the hallway, Margaret's voice was small and uncertain. "Elena, is everything all right?" Elena turned from the window, forcing a steadiness into her expression that she did not entirely feel. "I am not sure yet," she admitted. "But I think, cousin, that our troubles may not be quite as finished as we hoped." Edmund Hale kept his office above a quiet bookshop on a narrow street that most fashionable Londoners never had reason to visit, and he preferred it that way. It suited him to be underestimated. Men who judged him by his modest surroundings rarely saw the danger coming until it was already at their throats. He sat behind his desk that evening, turning a small silver coin over in his fingers, listening to Charlotte Price pace the narrow floor of his office with barely restrained frustration. "She did not believe me," Charlotte said. "She saw through it immediately. I do not think this plan of yours is working, Mr. Hale." "It is working exactly as intended," Hale said calmly. "You were never meant to convince her of anything permanently. You were meant to plant doubt. Doubt is a seed, Miss Price. It does not need to bloom today. It only needs to exist, quietly, waiting for the right moment to grow. And what moment is that?" Hale set down the coin and looked at her with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to wait for what he wanted. "The Duke settled a debt that I intended to use for considerably more than money. Do you understand what I mean by that, Miss Price?" Charlotte's pacing slowed. "You wanted the house. You wanted the Whitmore estate." "I wanted leverage," Hale corrected. "The house was only the beginning. A family desperate enough to lose everything is a family that can be persuaded to do a great many things to avoid ruin. The Duke, in his haste to impress a pretty face he met at a masquerade, took that leverage away from me before I had finished using it." "So this is revenge," Charlotte said flatly, not concerned for Elena Whitmore's welfare at all. "Everything is revenge, if you look closely enough," Hale said, almost pleasantly. "But it need not concern you, Miss Price, beyond the role I am asking you to play. You wish to see the Duke humbled, do you not? You wish to see him lose something, the way he made you lose your place in society 3 years ago." Something dark and wounded flickered across Charlotte's face. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I will not pretend otherwise." "Then continue as we discussed. Small doubts, small suggestions. Let Miss Whitmore's own uncertainty do the rest of the work for us. She is already frightened, already unsure of a man whose reputation precedes him everywhere he goes. We need only give that fear enough fuel, and it will consume the match entirely on its own, without either of us needing to lift a finger beyond a few well-placed words. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small, cluttered office around her, at the ledgers stacked high with other people's debts and desperation. And if it does not work? If she loves him regardless of what we say? Hale's expression did not change, but something colder entered his voice. Then we will require a different approach. I have not survived this long in my trade by relying on only one plan, Miss Price. I assure you, I have others prepared, should the gentle methods fail to produce the result we require. Charlotte did not ask what those other methods might be. Some part of her, buried beneath the bitterness and wounded pride that had brought her to this office in the first place, understood that she did not truly want to know. 3 days later, Elena received a second letter. This one was not slipped beneath her door in darkness. It arrived by messenger, in broad daylight, addressed formally to Miss Elena Whitmore, sealed with plain wax and no identifying mark. She opened it in the front parlor, Margaret watching anxiously from across the room. The letter was brief, and considerably more direct than the first. Miss Whitmore, you have been misled about the nature of the debt your family owed. It was not a simple loan, easily settled. It was tied to an agreement made by your late uncle, one that involved considerably more than money, and that the Duke's payment has not fully resolved, regardless of what he has told you. If you wish to understand the true danger your family still faces, meet me at the address below, alone, this Thursday at 3 o'clock. Come without informing the Duke. His involvement will only complicate matters further, and may put your family at greater risk. There was no signature, only an address on a street Elena did not recognize, somewhere near the docks, far from the fashionable neighborhoods she was accustomed to. You cannot possibly consider going, Margaret said, reading over her shoulder, her voice tight with alarm. Elena, this is clearly some kind of trap. I know that, Elena said slowly, though her mind was already turning the problem over, examining it from every angle, the way she had once examined household accounts, searching for the thread that would make sense of the whole tangled mess. But if I ignore it entirely, we may never learn what Edmund Hale actually wants, or how far he is willing to go to get it. And if there is some truth buried in this letter, some genuine danger to our family that the debt payment did not resolve, I would rather know it than remain ignorant. Then tell Alexander, let him handle it. The letter specifically warns against that. Of course it does, Margaret said, exasperated, because whoever sent it knows the Duke would see through this instantly and protect you from whatever trap they are setting. Elena considered this, turning the letter over in her hands. Her cousin was right, she knew, and yet something in her rebelled against the idea of hiding behind Alexander's protection entirely, of becoming, once again, a woman whose fate was decided and managed by others while she waited passively to be told what to do. I will tell him, she said finally, but not before I understand more of what we are dealing with. I want to see this address for myself first, from a distance, without meeting anyone. I only wish to understand what kind of place this is, what kind of trap it might be, so that when I do bring this to Alexander, I bring him useful information, rather than simply fear. Elena, that is still incredibly reckless. I will take the carriage, I will not leave it, I will simply look, and return. And then we will send word to Alexander together. Please, Margaret. I need to feel as though I am doing something, rather than only waiting to be rescued from a danger I do not yet understand. Margaret's protests continued for some time, but eventually, seeing the determination fixed in her cousin's expression, she relented, on the strict condition that their most trusted household man, a broad, steady former soldier named Peter, who had served the family for over a decade, would accompany the carriage and remain close at all times. Thursday arrived cold and overcast, fitting weather for the errand ahead. Elena dressed plainly, wrapped herself in a dark cloak, and set out with Peter driving, her heart beating fast beneath her composed exterior, as the familiar streets of her neighborhood gave way gradually to narrower, rougher lanes near the docks, where the air smelled of salt and tar, and something colder underneath, something that spoke of desperation and danger in equal measure. The address on the letter turned out to be a warehouse, tall and windowless along its street-facing side, with a single door set into weathered wood, and no sign to indicate what business, if any, took place within. Elena had Peter stop the carriage a safe distance away, and she studied the building from behind the small window, searching for any sign of who might be waiting inside. She did not have to wait long. The door opened, and a man stepped out into the gray afternoon light, dressed in a plain dark coat, unremarkable in every way, except for the sharp, assessing manner in which his eyes swept the street, immediately finding the carriage, despite the distance Elena had maintained. Edmund Hale did not approach. He simply looked at the carriage for a long moment, and then, with a small, unhurried smile that chilled Elena more than any shout or threat could have, he inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a fellow player who had made a clever but ultimately insufficient move on a shared board, and turned back inside without a word. "Go," Elena said quietly to Peter, her heart hammering. "Take us home immediately." The carriage lurched into motion, and Elena sat back against the worn seat, her mind racing. Hale had known she would come, had perhaps expected exactly this cautious approach, this careful distance. The realization settled cold and uncomfortable in her stomach. She had come intending to gather information on her own terms, and instead, she suspected, she had only confirmed for Edmund Hale precisely the kind of woman he was dealing with. Cautious, clever, unwilling to walk blindly into an obvious trap, but also, crucially, unwilling to simply run to the Duke for protection at the first sign of danger. She did not yet understand what use that information might be to him. She would understand soon enough, and by then, the pieces Hale had been so patiently arranging would already be moving into position around her, closer and more dangerous than she had allowed herself to imagine. That evening, true to her word, Elena sent for Alexander and told him everything. The second letter, her decision to view the warehouse from a distance, Hale's chilling acknowledgement of her presence. Alexander's expression darkened with each detail, his composure fraying visibly by the time she finished. "You went there," he said, voice tight, with a controlled fury that Elena had not yet seen directed at anyone, though she understood immediately it was not aimed at her. "You went to meet a man I explicitly warned you was dangerous, without telling me first." "I did not meet him," Elena said carefully. "I only looked. And I am telling you now, exactly as I promised I would. Elena, if something had happened to you." "But it did not," she said firmly. "I was careful. I brought Peter. I never left the carriage. I am telling you this because I trust you, Alexander, not because I have done something wrong that requires forgiveness. I needed to understand this danger with my own eyes, not only through your protection. Can you understand that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, clearly warring between the urge to argue further and some deeper recognition of what she was telling him. Finally, some of the tension left his shoulders, replaced by something closer to reluctant respect. "I do understand it," he admitted, "though it does not make me any less frightened by what you did. Hale is not a man who makes idle threats, Elena. If he has gone to the trouble of drawing you toward him directly, he intends something considerably beyond simple financial leverage. What do you think he wants?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I do not know yet, entirely. But I intend to find out, and this time, I would ask that we face it together, rather than either of us attempting to manage it alone. Will you agree to that, at least?" Elena felt something warm settle in her chest, despite the fear still churning underneath. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He reached for her hand, and she gave it willingly, and for a moment, sitting together in the small parlor with danger gathering somewhere in the shadows beyond their reach, Elena felt something steady and certain settle between them, a partnership forming in the face of threat, rather than a fear that might otherwise have pulled them apart. "There is something else," Alexander said slowly, "that I think you should know, given everything unfolding around us." "What is it?" "I made inquiries about Edmund Hale after you first mentioned his name," he said. "It seems his business dealings extend considerably further than simple money lending. There are whispers, unproven but persistent, that he has been involved in arranging disappearances for men who owed him large sums and could not pay. Not deaths, as far as anyone can determine, but removals, quiet and permanent, from London society, and sometimes from London altogether." Elena's blood ran cold. "You think he intends something like that for my family?" "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that a man capable of such things, and patient enough to plant doubt through old wounds like Charlotte Price rather than moving directly, is not a man who will simply give up because his initial plan failed. I think we must be very careful indeed, and I think, Elena, that whatever happens next, I do not intend to let him near you or your family again." The fire crackled low in the grate, and outside, the evening had settled into full darkness, and somewhere across the city, in a cluttered office above a quiet bookshop, Edmund Hale sat turning his silver coin over and over between his fingers, already considering his next move, already certain, in the patient, unhurried way of a man who had built his fortune on other people's desperation, that Elena Whitmore and the Duke of Ashcombe had not yet begun to understand the true depth of the danger now closing slowly around them. The following weeks fell into a strange new rhythm, one built equally of tenderness and vigilance. Alexander placed two of his most trusted men, quiet and capable, to watch the Chapel Street house without drawing attention, and he called on Elena nearly every day, sometimes for tea and conversation that felt almost ordinary despite everything gathering beneath the surface, and sometimes simply to walk the small garden together, saying little, content only to be near one another, in the face of a danger neither could yet fully name. It was during one such walk, nearly 2 weeks after Elena's visit to the warehouse, that Alexander finally brought her news. "I have learned something about your uncle," he said, as they walked slowly along the garden path, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. "Something I believe explains why Hale's letter claimed the debt involved more than money." Elena's stomach tightened. "Tell me." "Your uncle did not only borrow money from Hale," Alexander said carefully. "Nearly 3 years ago, before the shipping losses became public, he entered into a private agreement involving a piece of property, land near the northern coast that has, as it turns out, recently proven valuable, for reasons that had nothing to do with shipping at all. Coal, Elena. Substantial coal deposits were discovered on that land only last year, deposits worth considerably more than the debt itself, more, I suspect, than the entire remaining Whitmore fortune combined." Elena stopped walking, staring at him. "My uncle never mentioned owning land near the coast. I do not believe he understood its value when he pledged it as partial security against the loan," Alexander said. "I suspect neither did Hale. Not fully, not until recently. But something has changed. Hale has spent considerable effort in the past month attempting to establish clear legal claim to that land, effort that goes well beyond what a simple, settled debt would require." "So this was never truly about the money," Elena said slowly, understanding arriving cold and clear. "It was about the land all along. My family's poverty, my uncle's foolish investments, even Margaret's desperate wager, all of it simply the path that led Hale towards something he wanted considerably more than a settled debt. I believe so, yes. And settling the original debt did not resolve his claim to the land." "No," Alexander said grimly. "If anything, I believe it has made him more determined to secure it through other means, since his original leverage over your family has been removed. Which brings us, I believe, to why he sought your presence at that warehouse, and why Charlotte's doubts were planted so carefully in the days before." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "He needs something only I can give him, some claim, some signature, something tied to the land that requires my agreement rather than only my uncle's original pledge." "That is my suspicion as well," Alexander said. "Though I have not yet confirmed precisely what form that claim would need to take, I have engaged a solicitor, discreetly, to examine the original agreement your uncle signed and determine exactly what rights, if any, remain contested." Elena resumed walking, her mind working quickly through the implications. "If Hale believes he needs my cooperation to secure clear claim to the land, then perhaps that explains why he has not simply threatened us outright. He requires something from me that force alone cannot easily obtain." "Precisely," Alexander said. "Which means, unpleasant as it is to say, that you are currently safer than I initially feared, so long as he believes cooperation remains possible. It also means we must move carefully and discover the truth of the agreement before he finds some other way to force your hand." They continued walking in silence for a time, the weight of this new understanding settling between them. Finally, Elena spoke again, something resolute entering her voice. "I want to see the original agreement myself," she said. "Whatever my uncle signed, whatever rights are contested, I want to understand it fully, rather than only hearing it explained secondhand." "I expected you might say that," Alexander said, something like admiration coloring his voice, despite the seriousness of the moment. "My solicitor should have copies within the week. I will bring them to you the moment they arrive." True to his word, 6 days later, Alexander arrived at Chapel Street with a leather folder containing copies of the original agreement, along with several pages of careful notes prepared by his solicitor. Elena spread the documents across the parlor table, and together, she and Alexander pored over the dense legal language for the better part of the afternoon, Margaret hovering nearby, occasionally offering observations of her own. The agreement, once they had worked through its complicated phrasing, revealed a troubling truth. Elena's uncle had pledged the coastal land as security for the loan, but the document contained an unusual clause, one requiring the agreement of any surviving heir before the land could be fully transferred in the event of default. Since Elena's uncle had passed away the previous winter, quietly, his heart giving out under the weight of years of financial strain, that clause now applied directly to Elena herself, as his closest surviving relative with any legal standing in the matter. "He needs my signature," Elena said slowly, understanding settling cold and clear. "Without it, whatever claim he believes he has to that land remains contested, regardless of the original debt or its repayment." "Yes," Alexander confirmed, his expression grim. "Which explains a great deal about his methods these past weeks. He cannot simply seize the land through threat or force, without risking a legal challenge that could unravel his entire claim. He needs you to sign willingly, or at least to appear to sign willingly, in a manner that would hold up under scrutiny." "Then I will simply refuse," Elena said. "I will not sign anything, regardless of what pressure he applies." "I do not doubt your resolve," Alexander said carefully, "but a man like Hale rarely relies on only one method of persuasion. If doubt and rumor have not moved you, and if you refuse to sign willingly, I fear he may attempt something considerably more direct." Elena felt a chill at the certainty in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Alexander said, "that we must consider the possibility that he may attempt to force your signature through means neither of us would wish to imagine: threat, coercion, perhaps worse. I do not say this to frighten you unnecessarily, Elena, but because I believe we must prepare for it, rather than be caught unaware." The parlor fell silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over all three of them. Margaret, who had been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Then we must be the ones who move first," she said, rather than waiting for him to act. Elena looked at her cousin with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret said, drawing herself up with a determination Elena had not seen from her since before their family's fortunes collapsed, "that this began, in some part, because of my recklessness. I will not sit idle, while you and His Grace do all the work of protecting our family from a danger my own foolishness helped create. If there is some way I can help uncover Hale's plans, or delay him, or draw his attention away from Elena while you build whatever legal defense is necessary, I want to be part of it." Alexander studied Margaret for a long moment, something considering in his expression. "There may be a way," he said slowly. "Hale does not yet know the full extent of what we have discovered about the land, or the solicitor's involvement. If we can maintain that advantage a little longer, gathering clear legal protection for Elena's position before he realizes we understand his true motive, we may be able to close this matter entirely before he has the chance to attempt anything more drastic." "How can I help with that?" Margaret asked. "You know Hale, at least slightly, from your original dealings with him," Alexander said. "If you were to reach out, carefully, expressing willingness to discuss the debt further, perhaps suggesting Elena remains uncertain and might yet be persuaded, it could buy us the time we need without placing Elena herself in direct danger." Elena's stomach twisted with unease. "You want to use Margaret as bait?" "Not bait," Alexander said firmly. "A delay, nothing more. I would never suggest placing either of you in true danger. But if Hale believes his original plan remains viable a while longer, he may hold back from more drastic measures, giving us the time necessary to secure your legal position beyond his reach." Margaret nodded slowly, resolve settling into her expression despite the fear Elena could see plainly underneath it. "I will do it," she said. "I owe Elena that much, and considerably more besides." Elena reached over and took her cousin's hand, gratitude and worry tangled together in her chest. "Only if you promise to be careful," she said. "I do not wish to trade one danger for another." "I promise," Margaret said, and though her voice trembled slightly, her resolve did not waver. Over Over the following days, the plan took careful shape. Margaret sent a cautiously worded note to Hale's office, expressing continued concern about her family's obligations and suggesting a willingness to discuss matters further, without specifying exactly what that discussion might entail. Alexander's solicitor worked urgently to establish clear legal documentation of Elena's inherited rights regarding the coastal land, seeking to close the very loophole Hale had been attempting to exploit. And Elena, though she chafed at being asked to remain largely at home during this delicate period, occupied herself with careful preparation of her own, reviewing every document Alexander brought her, learning the precise language of her rights so thoroughly that she could recite the relevant clauses from memory. It was during this tense, careful waiting period that Elena and Alexander's relationship deepened in ways neither had fully anticipated. Forced into close, constant collaboration, stripped of the careful formality that had governed their earlier visits, they found themselves working as true partners, each bringing different strengths to the shared problem before them. Alexander's careful strategic mind paired naturally with Elena's sharp attention to detail, and her stubborn refusal to accept any explanation that did not fully satisfy her scrutiny. More than once, Elena caught an error or inconsistency in the solicitor's careful notes that even Alexander had missed, and more than once, Alexander's understanding of London's complicated legal and social landscape illuminated dangers Elena would never have anticipated on her own. "You would have made an excellent solicitor yourself," Alexander said one evening, watching her work through a particularly dense section of legal text with a focus that reminded him, not for the first time, of exactly why he had been so thoroughly captivated by her from their very first dance. "Women are not permitted to become solicitors," Elena said, not looking up from the page. "No," he agreed, "which I have always found to be a considerable waste of talent, given how many women I have met who possess sharper minds than half the men currently practicing law in London." Elena looked up at that, something warm and pleased flickering across her face, despite the seriousness of the work before them. "That is a rather progressive opinion for a duke to hold, Your Grace." "I have found," he said, "that spending time with you has made me reconsider a great many opinions I once held, without much thought at all." Their eyes met across the small table, and for a long moment, the danger gathering around them seemed to recede, replaced by something quieter and more certain. A recognition of exactly how deeply they had come to rely on one another, not merely for protection or convenience, but for the simple, steady comfort of being truly understood. "Alexander," Elena said softly, "whatever happens with Hale, whatever comes of all this danger and uncertainty, I want you to know that these past weeks, working alongside you, have shown me more clearly than any ballroom or garden walk ever could, exactly why I have come to care for you as deeply as I do." Something shifted in his expression, raw and unguarded. "Elena, I—" A sharp knock at the front door interrupted him, urgent and insistent, cutting through the quiet intimacy of the moment. Elena and Alexander exchanged a glance, both immediately alert, and Elena rose quickly to answer it herself, her heart already pounding with a sense of foreboding she could not quite explain. She opened the door to find Peter standing on the step, his usually calm face tight with alarm. "Miss Whitmore," he said urgently, "it is your cousin. Miss Margaret went to meet with Mr. Hale's associate this evening, as arranged, at the location they specified. She has not returned, and it has been well past the agreed hour." Elena's blood went cold, the warmth of the moment, before shattering instantly into raw fear. Behind her, she heard Alexander rise quickly from his chair, already reaching for his coat. "Where was she meant to meet him?" he asked, his voice sharp with an urgency that matched Elena's own racing heart. "The warehouse near the docks," Peter said grimly. "The same address from the letter." Elena's stomach dropped entirely, the careful, patient plan they had built over the past days, suddenly feeling dangerously insufficient against whatever might now be unfolding in that dark, windowless building near the water. "We go now," Alexander said, already moving toward the door, his voice carrying the same controlled, dangerous authority Elena imagined had once made rivals across London tremble at the sound of his name. "Elena, stay here, where it is safe." "No," Elena said immediately, fierce determination cutting through her fear. "She is my cousin, my family. I am coming with you, Alexander, and I will not be talked out of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression, steady despite the fear plainly visible beneath it, must have convinced him that argument would only waste precious time. Then we go together, he said. But you stay close to me, and you do exactly as I say the moment we arrive. Do you understand? I understand, Elena said, already reaching for her cloak, her heart pounding with fear for Margaret and a fierce protective resolve that pushed the fear firmly aside. Now let us go. Every moment we delay is a moment my cousin remains in danger. They moved quickly out into the cold evening, the careful, patient plan of the past weeks, giving way suddenly to urgent, uncertain action. And as their carriage rattled swiftly through the darkening streets toward the docks, Elena found herself praying, silently and fervently, that whatever Edmund Hale intended for her cousin, they would not arrive too late to stop it. The warehouse loomed dark against the night sky, when their carriage finally rattled to a stop a short distance away, its windowless walls giving nothing away. No light, no sound, nothing to indicate whether Margaret was still inside, or whether they had already arrived too late. "Stay behind me," Alexander said quietly, stepping down from the carriage with a controlled tension in every line of his body that Elena had not seen from him before, something coiled and dangerous beneath his usual composure. "Peter, circle to the rear of the building. If there is another entrance, find it, but do not go in alone." Peter nodded and disappeared silently into the shadows along the building's side. Elena followed Alexander toward the single visible door, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it must be audible in the silent street around them. The door was unlocked. Alexander pushed it open slowly, and the two of them stepped into a vast, dim interior, lit only by a few scattered lanterns hanging from support beams overhead, the space around them filled with stacked crates and coiled rope, and the lingering smell of salt and tar that Elena remembered from her first cautious visit weeks before. "Margaret?" Elena called softly, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. A muffled sound answered her, from somewhere toward the back of the warehouse, and Elena's heart leapt with a desperate mixture of hope and fear. She started forward, but Alexander's hand caught her arm, holding her back. "Carefully," he said quietly. This could still be a trap. They moved together, slow and alert, toward the source of the sound, weaving between tall stacks of crates, until they finally found Margaret, seated in a wooden chair near the back wall, her hands bound loosely in front of her, a strip of cloth tied over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear and relief as she saw them approaching. Elena rushed forward and pulled the cloth away from her cousin's mouth, working quickly at the ropes binding her hands, while Margaret gasped out words in a rush. "He left," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Hale's man, the one who arranged the meeting. He tied me here perhaps 20 minutes ago and said someone would come collect me shortly, someone with papers I would need to sign on Elena's behalf, some kind of authorization. I do not know what he meant. I told him I had no such authority, and he only laughed and said it would not matter once the ink was dry, and witnesses confirmed my signature." Elena's blood ran cold as understanding settled over her. They intended to forge my authorization through Margaret, to claim she had power to sign in my place, or to disguise her signature as mine somehow. "We must go, now," Alexander said urgently, finally freeing the last of the rope from Margaret's wrists. "Whoever is coming to collect her could arrive at any moment, and I would rather not be here to greet them without considerably more preparation than we currently have." They helped Margaret to her feet, her legs unsteady after being bound for so long, and began moving quickly back toward the entrance. They had nearly reached the door when a new voice, calm and unhurried, cut through the dim warehouse air. "Leaving so soon, after I went to such trouble arranging tonight's little gathering?" Edmund Hale stepped out from behind a tall stack of crates, flanked by two large men, whose presence alone made Elena's stomach twist with fear. He looked entirely unbothered by their sudden appearance, his expression carrying the same patient, unhurried calm Elena remembered from her first distant glimpse of him weeks before. "Release my cousin's obligation to you entirely," Alexander said, stepping slightly forward, positioning himself between Hale and the two women behind him. "This ends tonight, Hale. I know what you truly want, and you know as well as I do that no forged signature will survive legal scrutiny once I bring this matter before the proper authorities." Hale's smile did not waver. "Perhaps not," he agreed pleasantly. "But legal scrutiny takes time, Your Grace, and by the time any court examines the matter closely, I will already have extracted and sold whatever value the land holds. through channels considerably less scrupulous than a courtroom. I do not need the claim to hold forever. I only need it to hold long enough. You will not touch either of these women, Alexander said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, a tone Elena had never heard from him before, one that made the two large men flanking Hale shift uneasily, despite their evident size advantage. Won't I? Hale said, something colder entering his pleasant expression. You are outnumbered, Your Grace, and considerably far from any help that might come running to your aid. I would think carefully before making threats you cannot back with anything beyond your reputation. He is not alone, Elena said suddenly, stepping forward despite Alexander's warning glance, her voice steady, despite the fear pounding through her chest. You forget, Mr. Hale, that I came here once before, weeks ago, and I did not come without care even then. Do you truly believe I would allow my cousin to walk into a meeting you arranged without ensuring considerably more protection than a single carriage and a former soldier? Something flickered across Hale's expression, the first hint of genuine uncertainty Elena had seen from him. At that moment, the warehouse's rear entrance burst open, and Peter appeared, not alone, but accompanied by two constables Alexander had, in fact, quietly arranged to have stationed nearby, the moment he learned of Margaret's meeting, a precaution he had taken without mentioning it, unwilling to raise false hope before it was confirmed necessary. Edmund Hale, one of the constables said, stepping forward with the calm authority of a man well accustomed to his work. You are to come with us regarding accusations of coercion and fraudulent legal dealings, filed this very evening by His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe, along with supporting documentation prepared by his solicitor. Hale's composure finally cracked, fury and disbelief warring across his face, as the two constables moved to restrain him, his men backing away quickly, unwilling to invite trouble on his behalf, now that the balance of the confrontation had shifted so suddenly against them. This is not finished, Hale spat, as the constables led him toward the door. You may win tonight, Your Grace, but men like me do not simply disappear because of one setback. Perhaps not, Alexander said calmly, watching him go with an expression that held none of the fear Hale had clearly hoped to provoke. But you will find, Mr. Hale, that pursuing this family further will cost you considerably more than whatever value that land might hold. I suggest you consider that carefully during whatever time the courts decide to grant you for reflection. Hale said nothing further, allowing himself to be led away into the night, his two remaining men melting quickly into the shadows, rather than face the constable's attention themselves. The warehouse fell suddenly, blessedly quiet, and Elena felt the tension that had gripped her entire body for the past hour finally begin to release, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and relief, so powerful her knees nearly buckled beneath her. You planned this, she said, turning to Alexander with something between disbelief and admiration. The constables, you knew this might happen. I hoped it would not, Alexander said, but I judged it wise to prepare regardless. I could not risk either of you walking into danger without some manner of protection arranged, even if it meant appearing overly cautious should the danger never fully materialize. Margaret, still shaky but steadying with each passing moment, reached out and gripped Alexander's arm, gratitude plain in her exhausted face. Thank you, she said. Whatever debt of trust I owe you for how this began, I believe tonight has repaid it considerably. You owe me nothing, Alexander said gently. You showed considerable courage tonight, Miss Ashford, walking into danger to help delay a man you knew to be dangerous. That is not something I take lightly, regardless of how our acquaintance began. They made their way back out into the cold night air, and Elena found herself walking close beside Alexander, her hand finding his without conscious thought, needing the steady warmth of his presence after the fear of the past hour. He squeezed her hand gently, understanding passing between them, without need for words. Is it truly over? Elena asked quietly, once they were settled in the carriage, Margaret dozing fitfully against the opposite seat, exhausted beyond measure by the ordeal. Hale's immediate threat, I believe, is largely ended, Alexander said carefully. The legal case against him should be strong, particularly with tonight's attempted coercion added to the existing evidence my solicitor has gathered regarding the original agreement. But men like Hale rarely vanish entirely, even when their immediate schemes fail. I do not think we should assume every danger has passed, simply because tonight ended in our favor. Elena nodded slowly, leaning her head against his shoulder, allowing herself, for the first time in what felt like weeks, to simply rest in the quiet comfort of his presence, rather than remaining constantly braced against the next threat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming tonight. For preparing for danger you hoped would never arrive. For being exactly the man I have come to know these past weeks, rather than the cold, ruthless Duke rumor always painted you to be." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his arm coming around her shoulders, drawing her closer against him in the swaying darkness of the carriage. "Elena," he said finally, his voice low and rough with an emotion he seemed to be fighting to fully contain, "I believe I have known, for some weeks now, that whatever began between us at that masquerade has become something considerably more significant than either of us anticipated. Tonight, watching you stand firm in the face of real danger, watching you insist on coming despite every reason to stay safely behind, I find I can no longer pretend this is simply admiration or fondness. I love you. Entirely, and without reservation, in a way I did not believe myself capable of feeling again, after everything that came before." Elena's breath caught, her heart swelling with an emotion so overwhelming it nearly stole the words from her before she could speak them. "I love you too," she said softly, lifting her head to meet his eyes in the dim carriage light. "I have, I think, for longer than I have been willing to fully admit, even to myself. Tonight only made it impossible to keep denying it any longer." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he closed the distance between them, pressing a gentle, careful kiss to her lips that carried within it every ounce of the fear and relief and overwhelming tenderness of the night behind them. When they finally parted, Elena rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet darkness of the carriage. "Whatever comes next," Alexander murmured. "Whatever remains of Hale's schemes, whatever challenges society still has in store for a duke who fell in love through a wager and a masquerade, I find I am no longer afraid of it, so long as I face it beside you." "Nor am I," Elena said softly, and settled back against him as the carriage carried them home through the quiet, darkened streets, the danger of the night behind them finally giving way to something warmer, steadier, and infinitely more certain than either of them had dared hope for, when this strange, unlikely story first began. The weeks following the warehouse confrontation brought a strange, uneasy calm to Chapel Street, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone quite trusts the clear sky above them. Edmund Hale remained in custody while the courts examined the evidence against him, and Alexander's solicitor worked steadily to close every remaining loophole in the original agreement, ensuring that Elena's inherited rights to the coastal land stood beyond any further legal challenge. Margaret recovered slowly from her ordeal, though she remained understandably shaken for some time, starting at unexpected sounds and sleeping poorly for the first week after her rescue. Elena spent many of those evenings sitting quietly with her cousin, offering the same steady comfort Margaret had once tried, however clumsily, to offer her. It was during this period of careful healing that society, inevitably, began to take notice of the connection between Elena Whitmore and the Duke of Ashcombe. The rumors began quietly at first, whispered speculation at dinner parties and card games, fueled by sightings of the Duke's carriage outside a modest house on Chapel Street, considerably more often than propriety strictly allowed. Then, as autumn deepened into the first cold edges of winter, the whispers grew louder, and Elena found herself, for the first time, the subject of open curiosity whenever she ventured into public spaces, curious eyes following her with an intensity she found deeply uncomfortable after a lifetime spent quietly at the edges of grand rooms. "They are calling you his mystery bride," Margaret said one afternoon, setting down a gossip sheet she had been reading with poorly concealed amusement. "Apparently half of London has decided you must be some foreign princess in disguise, given how thoroughly you managed to capture the famously cold Duke's attention." "That is absurd," Elena said, though she could not quite suppress a small smile at the notion. "Absurd or not, it means people are watching closely," Margaret said, her expression sobering slightly. "Elena, are you certain you wish to continue this so publicly? I know Alexander cares for you deeply, and I know you care for him in return, but a duke's marriage is not a private matter, however much either of you might wish it were." Elena considered this carefully. She had thought often, in quiet moments, about exactly what a future with Alexander would truly require of her. The scrutiny, the expectations, the weight of a title she had never sought and had, until recently, never imagined for herself. But each time she considered walking away from that weight, she found herself instead thinking of Alexander's steady hands, his honest confessions in the garden, the fierce protective determination with which he had faced Hale on her behalf, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her in its simplicity, that whatever challenges society might present, she did not wish to face a future without him in it. "I am certain," she said finally. "Whatever comes with it, Margaret, I have decided I would rather face it beside Alexander than live safely and quietly without him." Margaret smiled, though something wistful lingered beneath it. "Then I am glad for you, cousin. Truly." That evening, Alexander called with news that both eased and complicated their careful peace. The court had ruled decisively against Hale, finding sufficient evidence of coercion and fraudulent intent to result in a lengthy sentence, effectively removing him as an immediate threat for the foreseeable future. But the ruling had also, inevitably, drawn public attention to the case, and with it, curiosity about the young woman at its center. "There will be more scrutiny now," Alexander said, sitting across from Elena in the familiar parlor, his expression carrying a seriousness she had learned to recognize as genuine concern rather than mere formality. "The court proceedings revealed enough of our history together that London's gossip mills have considerably more material to work with than mere sightings of my carriage on your street." "I am not afraid of gossip," Elena said, though a small knot of unease still tightened in her stomach at the thought of the scrutiny to come. "I know you are not," Alexander said, "but I would not have you enter into this unprepared, Elena. Society can be cruel to those who marry outside its expected patterns, and however much I wish I could shield you from every unkind word, I know I cannot promise that entirely." Elena reached across the table and took his hand, steadying herself as much as him. "Then, let us face it together, exactly as we faced Hale. I did not fall in love with you because your life would be easy, Alexander. I fell in love with you despite knowing it would not be." Something in his expression softened, warmth and relief mingling with the seriousness that had governed his features moments before. "There is something I have been meaning to ask you," he said slowly, though I confess I had hoped to find a more romantic setting than this familiar parlor for the question. Elena's heart began to beat faster, understanding dawning even before he continued. "I do not wish to wait any longer to make my intentions plain," Alexander said, rising from his chair and moving around the table to kneel before her, drawing a small velvet box from his coat pocket with hands that, for the first time since she had known him, trembled slightly. "Elena Whitmore, I have loved you since a masquerade I attended, intending only to satisfy a debt of honor, and I have found, every day since, new reasons to love you further. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because of any wager or obligation, but because I cannot now imagine a future that does not include you beside me?" Elena stared at him, at the small ring nestled in its velvet box, at the raw, hopeful vulnerability in his expression, and felt her heart swell with an emotion so complete it left her briefly unable to speak. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with happy tears she made no effort to hide. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, and when he rose to draw her into his arms, Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely certain of exactly where her life was headed, not toward the quiet, careful survival she had grown accustomed to, but toward something rich and full, and genuinely her own to choose. But even as they held each other close in the warm parlor light, neither of them yet knew that Edmund Hale, sitting in his cell awaiting transfer to a more permanent prison, had one final card left to play, a last desperate attempt to unravel everything Elena and Alexander had built together. Set into motion through a single letter, he managed to smuggle out through a sympathetic guard in the days before their engagement became public knowledge. That letter was already on its way to Charlotte Price. Charlotte Price read Edmund Hale's letter 3 times before she allowed herself to fully understand what it was asking of her. He wrote from his cell in careful, controlled script, no longer the calm, unhurried man who had once turned a silver coin between his fingers in his cluttered office, but someone considerably more desperate, reaching for any tool left within his grasp before the walls of his situation closed entirely around him. "Miss Price, I understand my usefulness to you has likely ended, given my current circumstances, but I write to offer one final opportunity, both for my benefit and, I suspect, for yours as well. The Duke and Miss Whitmore have announced their engagement. A grand ball is planned within the fortnight to celebrate it publicly. I have learned, through connections that remain loyal to me despite my situation, that a public claim of prior promise, made convincingly and at the right moment, before the right witnesses, could still unravel this match entirely, regardless of whatever legal victories the Duke believes he has secured against me. You need only claim that his proposal to you 3 years ago included a private promise never formally broken, a promise he abandoned only in his grief rather than through genuine intent. Such a claim, made publicly, before society's most influential witnesses, could cast sufficient doubt to delay or even prevent this marriage, buying time for my associates to pursue other avenues regarding matters we have discussed previously. I ask only that you consider it, for whatever remains of your own wounded pride in this matter, if not for any continued loyalty to me. Hale. Charlotte set the letter down on her writing desk, her hands trembling slightly, and stared for a long time at the wall of her small, increasingly shabby lodgings. The rooms she had been forced to accept after her broken engagement had cost her both reputation and the comfortable home she once expected to inherit through marriage. She thought of Elena Whitmore's steady, unflinching gaze at their first meeting, the way the younger woman had seen through her manufactured concern almost immediately, recognizing the bitterness underneath, rather than the false worry Charlotte had tried to present. She thought of Alexander, cold and controlled even in the depths of his grief, ending their engagement with a formality that had wounded her pride considerably more than her heart, if she was entirely honest with herself, 3 years later, in the quiet privacy of her own reflection. Was she truly wounded because she had loved him? Or was she wounded because he had been the last, best chance at the comfortable, secure life she had been raised to expect, and its loss had cost her everything she had once taken for granted? The question sat uncomfortably in her chest, one she had avoided examining too closely for 3 long years, preferring instead the simpler narrative of a woman wronged, a woman entitled to whatever bitterness she chose to carry. She could do as Hale asked. She could stand before London's most influential families and claim a promise that had never truly existed, weave enough uncertainty into her words to plant real doubt in the minds of those who mattered most to Alexander's standing. It might work, it might not, but either way, it would certainly cause pain, considerable pain, to a woman who had never done anything to Charlotte beyond seeing through her lies with uncomfortable clarity. Charlotte sat with that thought for a long time, watching the candle on her desk burn slowly down, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not want to cause that pain, not truly, not when she examined the impulse honestly, rather than through the comfortable haze of old bitterness. She burned Hale's letter in the candle flame and watched it curl to ash, and told herself, firmly, that whatever remained unresolved in her own heart, she would not use Elena Whitmore's happiness to try to fill it. The decision brought less relief than she had hoped for, but it brought, at least, a strange and unfamiliar sense of having chosen, finally, to be something other than what her bitterness had made of her these past 3 years. Elena, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of Hale's final desperate scheme, or Charlotte's quiet rejection of it, occupied instead with the considerable preparations now consuming Ashcombe House, in anticipation of the grand engagement ball Alexander insisted upon holding. "You do not need to prove anything to society," Elena said, watching with mild exasperation as yet another delivery of flowers arrived at the great house, filling the entrance hall with a fragrance so thick it nearly overwhelmed her. "We could simply marry quietly and let London gossip about it however it pleases. I am not doing this to prove anything to society," Alexander said, though a small, amused smile tugged at his mouth as he watched her survey the growing chaos of preparations with evident bewilderment. "I am doing this because you deserve a celebration worthy of what you have endured to reach this moment, Elena, and because I find, rather to my own surprise, that I want the entire world to see exactly how happy you have made me." Elena softened at that, some of her exasperation melting into warm affection. "You are becoming rather sentimental, for a man once known throughout London as Merciless. You have had a considerable effect on me," he admitted. "I find I do not much mind it." The preparations continued at a steady, exhausting pace over the following days, gowns fitted and altered, menus discussed and revised, guest lists debated with a seriousness that struck Elena as faintly absurd, given everything else she had faced in recent months. Margaret, fully recovered now and delighting in the distraction the preparations offered, threw herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that made Elena smile, despite her own weariness with the endless details. "You look happy," Elena observed one afternoon, watching her cousin consult with the dressmaker over a bolt of pale blue silk, destined for Margaret's own gown as maid of honor. "I am happy," Margaret said, glancing up with a genuine, unguarded smile. "For the first time in longer than I care to admit, I spent so long believing our family's troubles were entirely my burden to fix, alone, through whatever desperate means presented themselves. Watching you and Alexander find your way to something so genuine, despite everything that stood in the way, has given me hope that perhaps our family's luck has finally turned, and that I need not carry every worry alone any longer." Elena reached over and squeezed her cousin's hand warmly. "We carry it together now," she said. "Whatever comes." The night of the ball arrived cold and clear, the great house ablaze with candlelight, every window glowing warm against the dark winter sky, carriages arriving in a steady stream, bearing the whole of fashionable London, eager to witness the union that had scandalized and captivated society in equal measure these past weeks. Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep silver blue silk, her hair arranged in an elegant style that felt, to her own surprise, entirely natural rather than borrowed or uncomfortable, the way such finery had once felt during her family's more difficult years. Alexander waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in formal black, his eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded entrance hall, warm and steady, despite the considerable audience gathered to watch this moment unfold. "You look radiant," he murmured, taking her hand as she reached the final step, drawing it to his lips with a formal reverence that nonetheless carried within it all the private warmth of everything they had built together these past months. "You look rather pleased with yourself," Elena teased quietly, "for a man who claimed he was not trying to prove anything to society tonight." "I never claimed I was not pleased," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Only that proving something was not my purpose. The pleasure, I confess, is entirely genuine." They moved together into the great ballroom, and the evening unfolded in a warm, glittering blur of music and conversation, of curious glances gradually softening into genuine warmth, as guest after guest found themselves charmed, despite their expectations, by Elena's quick wit and evident intelligence, by the unmistakable, unguarded happiness radiating from a man London had spent years believing incapable of such feeling. It was nearly midnight, the same hour that had marked the unveiling of masks at the masquerade so many months before, when the evening's careful harmony finally shattered. Charlotte Price arrived unannounced, slipping into the ballroom through a side entrance while most attention remained fixed on Elena and Alexander sharing their first dance as an officially engaged couple. She stood at the edge of the dance floor for a long moment, watching them move together with an ease and warmth that struck something deep and complicated in her chest, and found, standing there in the golden candlelight, that whatever resolve had led her to burn Hale's letter days before now wavered dangerously under the weight of watching this happiness unfold so completely without her. She had not come intending to make Hale's claim. She told herself this firmly, even as she moved closer to the dance floor, even as heads began to turn toward her unexpected presence, whispers rippling outward through the crowd, like water disturbed by a stone. She had come, she told herself, only to see it for herself, to finally close this chapter of her own life, by witnessing its ending fully, rather than imagining it from a distance. But standing there, watching Alexander's face as he looked at Elena, an expression she now understood, with painful clarity, he had never once turned toward her during their own engagement. Something old and bitter rose up in Charlotte's chest, despite every intention to remain silent. The music ended, Alexander and Elena separated from their dance, breathless and smiling, and it was in that unguarded moment, as the whole room applauded the newly engaged couple, that Charlotte's voice cut sharply across the sudden quiet that followed. "Before this celebration continues," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned ballroom, "I believe there is something the assembled guests deserve to know about the Duke of Ashcomb's history, with promises made and promises broken." The room fell utterly silent, 300 faces, turning as one, toward the striking dark-haired woman standing at the edge of the dance floor, and Elena felt her stomach drop with dread, even as Alexander's hand tightened protectively around hers. both of them understanding immediately that whatever fragile peace they had built these past weeks was about to be tested before the entire assembled weight of London society. For a long, terrible moment, no one in the ballroom moved. 300 faces remained fixed on Charlotte Price, waiting, and Elena felt the weight of every one of those gazes pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. Her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain it must be audible to those standing nearest her. Alexander stepped forward slightly, placing himself, as he had at the warehouse months before, between Elena and the source of the threat, though this danger wore silk and pearls rather than the rough clothing of Hale's men, and could not be countered with constables or careful legal argument. "Miss Price," he said, his voice level and controlled, despite the tension Elena could feel radiating through his hand, still clasped around hers. "Whatever you believe you have come here to say, I would ask that you consider carefully before you say it, before this audience, in this manner." "I have considered it carefully," Charlotte said, though something in her voice wavered slightly, uncertain despite her bold opening. "For 3 years, Your Grace, I have considered very little else." The crowd murmured, a low ripple of scandalized anticipation moving through the assembled guests, and Elena felt Margaret's hand find her other arm, steadying her, offering silent support in the face of whatever was about to unfold. "Then say what you came to say," Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, cutting through the tension, with a directness that drew Charlotte's attention fully onto her, for the first time since her dramatic entrance. "I would rather hear it plainly than watch you circle it further before this entire room." Something flickered across Charlotte's face, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect for the younger woman's composure. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and Elena watched, with a strange, suspended clarity, as some internal battle played out visibly across Charlotte's expression, the bitter resolve that had carried her into the ballroom, warring against something else entirely, something that looked, increasingly, like doubt. "I came here," Charlotte said finally, her voice considerably quieter now than her opening declaration, though it still carried clearly through the silent room, "prepared to tell you all that the Duke made me a private promise 3 years ago, one he broke without honor when it became inconvenient to keep it. I was given a letter, encouraging me to make exactly that claim, at exactly this moment, in exactly this room, in order to cast doubt sufficient to delay or prevent this marriage." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Elena felt Alexander go rigid beside her, though whether from anger at Charlotte or anticipation of what she might say next, she could not immediately tell. "But standing here now," Charlotte continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, as though the act of speaking honestly was, itself, lending her a strength her earlier bitterness had lacked. "Watching the two of you tonight, I find I cannot make that claim, because it is not true, and I am tired, considerably tired, of carrying lies dressed up as wounded pride simply because the truth is less flattering to remember." The room remained utterly silent, hanging on every word. "The Duke made me no secret promise," Charlotte said. "He ended our engagement honestly, if coldly, in the depths of grief I did not have the patience to understand at the time. I have spent 3 years blaming him for a wound that was, in truth, mostly my own making, my own impatience, my own inability to offer comfort when comfort was most needed. Edmund Hale offered me a chance to use that old wound as a weapon against a happiness I found myself, tonight, unable to bring myself to destroy, however much my pride wished otherwise." She turned then, fully, to face Elena directly, something raw and unguarded in her expression that Elena had not seen from her before, not at their first meeting, not in any of the whispered rumors that had followed Charlotte's name through London society these past 3 years. "Miss Whitmore," Charlotte said, "I owe you a genuine apology, not a performance of one. I sent that first letter out of bitterness. I allowed Hale to use me as a tool against you, believing, foolishly, that causing you doubt might somehow ease my own old wounds. It did not. It has only shown me how small that bitterness has made me these past years, and I find, standing here tonight, that I would rather be something other than small, even if it costs me whatever satisfaction I imagined this confrontation might bring." The ballroom remained silent for a long moment, 300 guests processing this unexpected turn, the scandal they had braced for transforming, before their eyes, into something considerably more complicated, and in its own way, more moving. Elena stepped forward, releasing Alexander's hand, moving to stand directly before Charlotte, close enough that their conversation, though the room strained to hear it, felt suddenly private despite the audience. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, "for choosing honesty, even when the lie would have been considerably easier to tell. That took more courage than I think you realize." Charlotte's composure, carefully maintained through her long confession, finally cracked, tears gathering in her eyes that she made no effort to hide. "I do not deserve your kindness, Miss Whitmore, after everything I have done to threaten your happiness these past months." "Perhaps not," Elena said, something gentle entering her voice despite everything. "But I find I would rather offer it than continue carrying resentment toward a woman who has clearly suffered considerably from her own choices already, without my anger adding further weight to it." A murmur moved through the crowd, something warmer now than the scandalized anticipation of moments before. Admiration for Elena's grace, mixing with genuine surprise at Charlotte's unexpected honesty. Alexander stepped forward as well, addressing Charlotte with a formality that nonetheless carried genuine warmth beneath it. "Miss Price," he said, "I am sorry for the coldness with which I ended our engagement 3 years ago. I was drowning in grief I did not know how to share, and I handled our parting with considerably less compassion than you deserved, regardless of the disagreement that preceded it. I hope, in time, you find the same peace tonight has clearly begun to offer you." Charlotte nodded, unable to speak further through her tears, and after a long moment, she turned and made her way quietly from the ballroom, the crowd parting before her with a respect that had not been present when she first arrived, murmurs of genuine sympathy replacing the earlier anticipation of scandal. The silence that followed her departure held for only a moment before Alexander, with a composure that struck Elena as remarkable, given everything that had just unfolded, turned to address the assembled guests directly. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, a hint of his old, careful control returning now that the danger had passed, "that we have had quite enough drama for one evening. Might I suggest we return to the celebration this occasion actually calls for?" A ripple of relieved laughter moved through the crowd, and the orchestra, taking their cue from the shift in mood, struck up a new piece, warm and lively, drawing couples back onto the dance floor as the tension of Charlotte's confrontation gradually dissolved into renewed celebration. Alexander turned to Elena, offering his hand once more. "Might I have this dance, Miss Whitmore, or has tonight's excitement left you wishing for a quiet corner instead?" Elena laughed, relief and lingering adrenaline mixing into something bright and giddy in her chest, and placed her hand in his without hesitation. "I believe," she said, "that after everything we have faced these past months, one more dance is exactly what I need." They moved back onto the floor together, and as the music swelled around them, Elena found herself thinking of that first masquerade, of a masked stranger who had asked her to dance without revealing his name, of everything that single dance had eventually grown into. Danger and discovery, fear and fierce loyalty, and now, finally, a love that had weathered every test placed before it and emerged, if anything, stronger for having survived them. "You are smiling rather mysteriously," Alexander observed, guiding her through a graceful turn. "I am thinking," Elena said, "about how strange it is that everything began with one waltz, and a declaration I found so presumptuous at the time that I nearly walked away from you entirely." "And now?" he asked, echoing the same question he had asked her on the terrace all those months ago. Elena looked up at him, at the storm-gray eyes that had once seemed so cold, and now held nothing but warmth for her, at the sharp, careful face she had come to love so completely, and felt her heart swell with a certainty that needed no further words to explain itself. "Now," she said softly, "I could not imagine my life having unfolded any other way." The great clock in the corner of the ballroom began to chime midnight, the same hour that had once marked the unveiling of masks and the beginning of everything that followed, and this time, as the chimes rang out across the glittering room, Elena felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had gripped her that first night. She felt only the steady, certain warmth of a man who had proven, through every trial these past months had thrown before them, exactly the depth of his devotion, and the quiet, joyful anticipation of everything still waiting to unfold between them in the months and years ahead. Spring arrived early that year, unfolding across London with a gentleness that felt, to Elena, like the natural conclusion of everything the harsh winter months had put her and Alexander through. The gardens at Ashcombe House bloomed in careful, deliberate splendor, tended for weeks in anticipation of the wedding, now only days away, and Elena found herself, on a quiet morning in early April, standing at the edge of those gardens, watching the last of the frost melt from the grass beneath a pale, warming sun. "You are up early," Alexander said, joining her at the garden's edge, his coat still slightly rumpled from sleep, an informality she had grown to treasure in these private morning moments they increasingly shared. "I could not sleep," Elena admitted. "Too many thoughts, all crowding for attention at once." "Anything troubling you?" "No," Elena said, and found, examining the question honestly, that it was entirely true. "Only the strange sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous, something I have been building toward for months, without quite realizing how close it had come." Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against the warmth of his side. "I feel it too," he said, "though I confess my thoughts this morning have been considerably less philosophical than yours. I have mostly been wondering whether the tailor will finish altering my coat in time, given how insistent Margaret has been about every last detail of Thursday's arrangements." Elena laughed, the sound bright and easy in the quiet garden air. Margaret has thrown herself into wedding planning with the same fierce determination she once reserved for card games and desperate schemes. I confess, I find it rather touching, watching her pour so much care into ensuring everything is perfect. "She has more than earned the joy of it," Alexander said, "after everything these past months put her through." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the garden slowly wake around them, and Elena found herself thinking, as she often did in these quiet moments, of exactly how far they had traveled since that first masquerade. From strangers behind masks, to partners who had weathered danger, and doubt, and scandal together, emerging each time with their bond only strengthened by the trial. "Have you heard anything further about Hale's sentencing?" Elena asked, the question rising unbidden, though she had largely set aside her worry about him these past weeks, as the wedding preparations consumed most of her attention. "The final ruling came through yesterday," Alexander said. 15 years, given the severity of the coercion charges and the additional evidence gathered from his associates after his arrest. "He will not trouble our family again, Elena, not for a very long time, and by the time he might, we will have secured your claim to the coastal land so thoroughly that no legal challenge, however creative, could hope to unravel it." Relief settled warmly through her chest, a final piece of lingering worry finally laying itself to rest. "And Charlotte, have you heard anything of her since the ball?" Something softened in Alexander's expression. "She wrote to me, actually, several weeks ago. A short letter, mostly thanking us both for the grace we showed her that night. She has apparently taken a position as a companion to an elderly aunt in Bath, away from London's gossip and the weight of old reputation. She wrote that she hoped, in time, to build something quieter and more honest than the life she had been pursuing before." "I am glad," Elena said, and meant it fully. "I hope she finds whatever peace she is looking for." "As do I," Alexander agreed. "Whatever came before, I do not believe she was ever truly a villain in this story, Elena. Only someone wounded, who found herself, briefly, willing to wound others in return, before choosing something better." They fell quiet again, the morning sun climbing higher over the garden, warming the air around them with the first real promise of the season ahead. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a warm, busy blur, filled with final fittings and last-minute arrangements, with Margaret's cheerful, exacting supervision over every detail of the ceremony and the celebration to follow, with quiet evening visits between Elena and Alexander that grew increasingly precious as the wedding day drew nearer, each one carrying the sweet anticipation of everything still to come. Elena's gown, when it was finally finished, was a masterpiece of pale ivory silk, embroidered along the bodice with delicate silver thread that caught the light with every movement, simple enough to honor the modest life she had lived for so many years, elegant enough to befit the duchess she was about to become. She stood before the mirror on the morning of her wedding, Margaret fussing over the final arrangement of her hair, and found herself, for a suspended moment, unable to fully recognize the composed, radiant woman looking back at her. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly, meeting Elena's eyes in the mirror's reflection, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. I am so proud of you, Elena, of everything you have overcome to reach this moment. We overcame it together, Elena said, reaching back to squeeze her cousin's hand. I could not have survived any of it without you. Nor I without you, Margaret said, a small watery laugh escaping her. Now come. Your future husband is waiting, and I have been assured he is nearly as nervous as you are, which I confess I find rather satisfying, given how composed he always manages to appear. The chapel at Ashcombe House had been transformed for the occasion, filled with the same fragrant flowers that had once overwhelmed the entrance hall during the engagement ball preparations, arranged now with careful, elegant restraint along the aisle and around the altar where Alexander waited. Elena walked toward him on the arm of her uncle's oldest friend, a kind, elderly gentleman who had agreed to stand in for the father she had lost too young, and felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it nearly overwhelmed her composure entirely. Alexander's face, as she approached, held none of the careful control she had once found so intimidating on their first meeting, none of the cold reputation that had once preceded him through every London drawing room. He watched her walk toward him with an expression of open, unguarded wonder, as though he still could not quite believe his own good fortune, even after everything they had already survived together. "You are radiant," he murmured, once she had reached him, taking her hands in his with a reverence that made her breath catch. "You are not so bad yourself, Your Grace," she whispered back, earning a soft, surprised laugh from him that drew a ripple of quiet amusement from the assembled guests nearest the altar. The ceremony itself passed in a warm, golden blur, vows exchanged with a sincerity that needed no embellishment, rings placed on trembling fingers, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander drew Elena into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that drew soft, delighted applause from the gathered guests, sealing, at last, the promise that had begun so strangely, so unexpectedly, on the terrace of a masquerade ball nearly a year before. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, the great hall of Ashcombe House filled with music and laughter and the warm glow of countless candles, guests dancing and dining and toasting the newly married couple with a genuine warmth that would have seemed impossible, Elena reflected, if she had tried to imagine it during those first uncertain weeks, when London still whispered about the cold, merciless Duke and his mysterious bride. It was nearly midnight when Alexander finally drew Elena away from the crowd, out onto the same terrace where their story had truly begun, the cold night air a welcome relief after the warmth of the crowded hall. Below them, the garden stretched dark and quiet, the same garden where they had first confessed their fears and their honest histories to one another, now transformed by spring into something soft and blooming rather than cold and bare. "Do you remember?" Alexander said, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Standing on this very terrace, telling me you were no longer certain our dance had only been a game." "I remember," Elena said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I remember being terrified of how quickly everything was changing, and excited by it in equal measure." "And now?" he asked, the same question he had asked her twice before, on this terrace, and on the dance floor months later, each time carrying slightly different weight, slightly different meaning. Elena lifted her head to look at him, at the man who had once been a masked stranger and a rumored villain, and had become, through months of honesty and danger and unwavering devotion, the truest partner she could have ever hoped to find. "Now," she said, "I know it was never a game at all. Not really. Not from that very first dance. It was the beginning of exactly the life I did not know I was brave enough to want, until you showed me I could have it." Alexander leaned down and kissed her again, slow and certain beneath the star-scattered sky, and when they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing in the sweet, flower-scented night air. "One waltz," he murmured, echoing the declaration that had begun this entire improbable journey, though his voice now carried none of the cold demand rumor had once painted around those words, only warmth and certainty, and a promise he had spent every day since proving true. "And you were mine, Elena. From that very first moment, though it took us both considerably longer than one dance to understand exactly what that meant. And you were mine," Elena said softly, "though I confess, it took me rather longer to admit it aloud." The music drifted out to them from the great hall behind, warm and lively, and Alexander drew her back toward the doors, back toward the celebration still unfolding within, back toward the life they had built together, through honesty and courage, and a refusal to let fear or doubt or danger keep them apart. "Shall we dance again?" he asked, extending his hand the way he had at their very first meeting, though this time there was no mask between them, no hidden name, no secret wager waiting to complicate everything that followed. Only two people, fully known to one another, choosing, freely and completely, to build a life together. "Always," Elena said, placing her hand in his without hesitation, and together they returned to the warm, golden light of the celebration, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had started as a stranger's game and had become, through every trial they had faced and overcome together, the truest love either of them had ever known. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Elena would tell them the story exactly as it happened: a masquerade, a dance with a masked stranger, a declaration that had seemed, at first, like nothing more than a demanding duke's presumptuous claim. She would tell them about the danger that followed, the courage it had taken to face it, the honesty that had slowly built trust between two wounded, guarded people, until that trust became something unbreakable. And she would always end the story the same way, with a smile that Alexander, listening nearby, never quite managed to resist matching with one of his own. "He said one waltz and I would be his," she would tell them. "I thought, at the time, it was the most arrogant thing I had ever heard. It took me considerably longer than one dance to understand he was not wrong. He simply had not yet told me that I would be choosing him back, just as completely, and that in choosing each other, we would build something far greater than either of us could have imagined that very first night." The end.